Alright, good morning students. We are back with the videos on control and coordination, and I suppose this chapter was something that we were continuing earlier, but there was a certain gap. So I would recommend people to go back to their earlier slides and refer to it, so that from here on we have a clear understanding of the chapter and nothing is getting mixed up as well. Okay, so in control and coordination we have studied that the brain and the spinal cord have a pretty much major role to play. So the brain and the spinal cord are so if you look into the entire nervous system, okay, in human beings, here we are referring to the nervous system in human beings. Okay, so the main organs of the nervous system are, we have already learned, it is the brain, the spinal cord and the nerves. Okay, so the brain, the spinal cord and the nerves are pretty much the main organs of the nervous system. The sense organs like eyes, ears, tongue, nose and skin can be considered as the organs of the nervous system. Why? Because they are passing on the sensory information to the main nervous system. Okay, so main organs of the nervous system because they help in the functioning of the nervous system. So they can be considered as accessory organs of the nervous system. Until unless these are in place, the nervous system is not going to function properly. Okay, so you know, the other organs that we have as sense organs, they also are a part of the nervous system because they help in the functioning of the nervous system. Until unless our sense organs are intact, no matter how good our brain and spinal cord might be as a function unit, but it will not be able to correlate and coordinate properly. Okay, so just as the brain, spinal cord and the nerves are important, so is the different sense organs that we have. Okay, they are also a part of the nervous system. So the brain and the spinal cord are connected to all parts of the body by millions of nerves. So we have these millions of nerves which are connecting the brain and the spinal cord to the other parts of the body. Okay, the nerves which carry necessary messages from the body parts to the brain are called, or spinal cord, are called sensory nerves. So these are what? So they will carry, for example, when I use my hands to touch something which is very hot, my hands get removed, or if I come across a very pricky substance, my hands are immediately withdrawn. So my body is immediately withdrawn from that site. Why? Because the messages are passing from my sensory receptors to the brain or the spinal cord, and these messages are carried by the sensory nerves. So we have these sensory nerves which carry these messages to those brains and the spinal cord. Okay, so the nerves which carry messages from the brain and the spinal cord to the various parts of the body for action are called motor nerves. Now what are the motor nerves? So the information is passed on and there is a necessary action which is initiated by the brain and the spinal cord. The necessary action in this case will be withdrawal from that impending danger. Okay, withdrawal from that site. So whether it is withdrawal or whether it is you know, kind of favoring that, whatever with the response, that is accordingly coordinated. Okay, so you know, just as we withdraw from these things, why? Because the message is conveyed from the sensory nerves to the spinal cord or the brain, and accordingly the response that is generated from the spinal cord or the brain is carried to the motor nerves, which actually withdraw our hands or our feet wherever it is landing on if it is unfavorable to the body. Okay, so I hope this mix is clear. You can take a snapshot of the same while we proceed on to the next one. Right, so we will continue with the parts of the nervous system. So the parts of the nervous system, the first thing we have is the central nervous system, which is the main part of the nervous system. Okay, it consists of the brain and the spinal cord. As we have all studied, the brain and the spinal cord are the main organs of the nervous system. So the central nervous system will consist of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, now we have something called as the peripheral nervous system, which is the outer periphery. It consists of all the nerves of the body like cranial nerves, then we have spinal nerves and the visceral nerves as well. So all these are basically the different types of nerves that we have. Consists of the nerves of all the nerves of the body like cranial nerves. Now what are the cranial nerves? Cranial nerves are the ones which connect all the parts of the head directly to the brain. So here we have the human head, here we have the eyes, let's say the tongue, then we have the nose, then we have the ear, and of course we have the skin as well. Okay, so all these are what? These are sensory organs. Okay, the nose gives us the sense of smell, the tongue gives us a sense of taste, the eyes gives us a sense of sight, and the ears give us the sense of hearing. So all these are basically connected directly to the brain by cranial nerves. So all total of all the nerves that we have in the head part are known as cranial nerves. So these are the cranial nerves that we have, and they connect to all parts of the head directly to the brain. So they connect all the parts of the head directly to the brain. Okay. Spinal nerves are the ones which connect all the remaining parts of the body like the muscles and the skin to the spinal cord. So spinal nerves are the ones which basically connect all the parts of the body to the spinal cord. Okay, so the legs are connected to the spinal cord, the hands are connected to the spinal cord. So all the different parts of the body are connected by the nerves, the spinal nerves to the spinal cord. Okay, okay. So visceral nerves, then we have the third kind of nerves which are visceral nerves. Now some of the visceral nerves, most of the visceral nerves generally get connected to the spinal cord. However, there are some which connect directly to the brain as well. Okay, so connect the internal organs of the body. They basically connect the internal organs of the body to the spinal cord. However, there are some which might even get directly connected to the brain. Okay, so what is the peripheral nervous system? Peripheral nervous system is actually made up of two types of nervous systems, and one is the voluntary nervous system, which is under the voluntary control of the brain. It is in direct control of the brain. Okay, voluntary means voluntarily the brain is controlling this system, and there's, for example, the movement of my hands, the movement of my feet, the movement of my entire body when I am running or walking. Okay, all these are basically under the control, direct control of the brain, willful control of the brain, and that is the voluntary nervous system. Under the voluntary control of the brain and the autonomous nervous system, there are certain processes which are going inside my body automatically. Respiration is happening automatically, heartbeat is happening automatically, excretion is happening automatically. So all these are happening automatically, and hence we call this as autonomous system, which operates automatically or involuntarily. Okay, which operates automatically or involuntarily. So these are the parts of the nervous system. Okay, you can take a snapshot of the same. So we move on now to what are reflex actions. Okay, reflex actions are actions which we perform without without us even knowing about it. Okay, so there are certain actions that we will perform each and every day without our entire involvement in it. Okay, so reflex actions are basically simplest form of response in the nervous system. They are one of the simplest forms of response in the nervous system, and this is basically called a reflex action. Okay, so it's a rapid and automatic response to the stimuli. So there is an automatic and rapid response that is generated to the stimuli, not under the voluntary control of the brain. This is not, see, the brain is not participating in this action. It doesn't need to. It's more or less an autopilot mode. Okay, so response to the stimuli not under the voluntary control of the brain. This is not under the voluntary control of the brain. So reflex action is one which we perform very automatically. Okay, so it's more or less an involuntary action if we consider it to be a very involuntary action. For example, some stimulus, if we have the same stimulus, there will be more or less a same response generated to it. For example, if I land up on something which is pricky or which has a sharp edge, I will immediately withdraw myself from there. Okay, so it will happen today. If it happens tomorrow, my response is going to be the same. Okay, if accidentally I happen to touch or put my hand on something hot, I will immediately withdraw my hand. The same response will be generated for the same temperature day after day. Okay, so there is no it will have the same stimulus is generated, the same stimulus will have the same response every time. Every time the same incident happens or the same stimulus is generated, our response is going to be very much programmed to respond in the same way. Okay, so what are the examples of reflex action? Moving our hands automatically on touching a hot object. So if there's a hot object, we immediately remove our hand. That is one thing. Okay, withdrawal of our feet on stepping on something sharp. If we have accidentally stepped on something sharp or something pricky, we will remove our feet immediately. A knee jerk, okay, a jerk of the knee. So we will avoid anything which will induce a knee jerk. Movement of the diaphragm during respiration. See, our diaphragm is moving up and down during respiration. It is happening involuntarily. Okay, for example, when we cough, what happens? Why do we cough? Something is stuck in our windpipe, and hence there is an immediate response of a high pressure air through our windpipe, and that's when we cough. Okay, so coughing, so we would not go internally inside to see what is stuck. It will happen automatically. The moment something is stuck in our windpipe, we will immediately cough up. Okay, so yawning, see, when you are in a resting mode and more or less bored by watching these videos, most of you will be yawning, I know for a fact. Okay, but this will not happen when you are watching something stupid in TikTok or whatever. Okay, so most of us, this happens with me, this happens with you as well. So whenever we are watching something which is concerned with education or subject or something which is important in our development, we generally go a little slow and we generally get bored of these things. So yawning indicates that you are bored and you are least interested in whatever is happening. This is also a response to the stimulus. So whatever is happening in your external environment, you are least interested in it, and that's the sign, yawning. Okay, that's also a response to your stimulus. Stimulus is that the neighboring environment in your surrounding environment is not very much engraving or engaging. Okay, so that's when you yawn. That's also a response to stimulus, and it doesn't. So you don't consciously yawn. If you are consciously yawning, then you are alert. Okay, you are doing it because you are not alert and you don't want to get alert. That's the basic point of yawning. Blinking of eyes, for example, are we conscious when we are blinking our eyes? Now the blinking of eyes is very much necessary. Okay, it's a very necessary step, because if you keep your eyes wide open without blinking consciously, you will have tears rolling down your eyes and you will feel that strain. Okay, and that's not good for the eyes. Okay, they need to keep on blinking because the liquid surface which is above our eyes, it's very important for the eyes to function properly. Okay, so it's very important that the eyes keep on blinking so that the liquid content is kept intact. However, if we don't do that, then the liquid will drain out and we will feel the strain. Okay, so that is there. Sneezing, for example, if something is stuck in our nasal pipes, or so we will sneeze. That's an automatic action. Okay, you don't do it consciously. Okay, so in a reflex action, we are unaware that anything is going to happen to us. We are not aware that anything is going to happen to us. For example, if I don't blink my eyes, I will obviously feel strained out. Okay, if something is stuck in my windpipe, I might be choked. Okay, so it is very important that I get a coughing sensation or I sneeze it out. Okay, so these are things which will automatically happen and the brain doesn't need to deeply get involved in it. So these are basically called reflex actions. Your yawning, your blinking of eyes that we do throughout the day, all these are responsive in a way response to the stimulus, but in a different way. There is no direct involvement of the brain in these things. Okay, are we clear on this one? So we can make a note of the same while we proceed ahead to the next slide. So we have studied what is a reflex action. Now we'll understand what is a reflex arc. Okay, so what an arc means here is the entire pathway of a reflex action. Okay, so let's say the reflex arc is the pathway or the route taken by the nerve impulses in a reflex action. This is called the reflex arc. The entire pathway which is taken by a reflex action, okay, the entire pathway that is taken is called the reflex arc. Okay, and it is important that we understand this. Okay, so let's say there is a hot object and your hand just happens to touch it. So our hands will be automatically pulled off. Okay, why does this happen? And is there a deep thinking process involved in it? No, we don't have the time. Okay, because if our brain spends that, see, understand this, you are given a problem, let's say in mathematics or science, and you are thinking about the concepts that are involved in solving the problem. That is a time consuming process. It might take 2 minutes, it might take 3 minutes, it might take 5 minutes, depending upon the difficulty level of the problem. Your brain will start thinking about it and solve this. Okay, it might be able to solve or it might not be able to solve, depending how you connect things. Okay, but in this case we don't have that much of time. Within a fraction of a second the hand needs to be pulled off, otherwise we will get serious injuries. Okay, we will be burnt in that place. So here deep thinking is not required. The direct involvement of brain, which has the major functioning of thinking, is not required here. So if it is not required, then exactly what would be the pathway in which the entire message is passing on and the action is getting generated? If we need to understand this, the process is understanding the reflex arc. So it is the entire pathway or the route taken by the arc. Okay, so let's understand this. Okay, so when we are basically touching a hot object, our hand is immediately pulled off. There is no deep thinking required for this. It is an automatic process. Obviously the hand will be pulled off within a fraction of a second. Okay, you won't even get the time to think. The action has already happened. Okay, so what happens is, here in our hand we have thermoreceptors. Okay, now these thermoreceptors are basically receptors which receive heat. Okay, so different types of receptors are there. Olfactory receptors are there which sense smell. Okay, auditory receptors are there which basically sense the hearing. There are light receptors which basically sense light. Okay, so in the same way in our skin we have thermoreceptors which can basically receive the amount of heat, and the moment the thermoreceptor gets in touch, the moment a hand gets in touch with a hot object, the thermoreceptors sense the heat and it is passed on by the nerves to the spinal cord. Okay, passed on by the nerves to the spinal cord. The moment the spinal cord acknowledges that this heat is dangerous, okay, for the entire body, okay, there it is passed on to the relay neuron. Okay, by sensory neurons, thermoreceptors pass on the message to the spinal cord by means of sensory neurons, and the moment it gets passed to the spinal cord, this is basically the place of the spinal cord. Okay, not very far away from our hand or even from our feet. Okay, the spinal cord acknowledges this and it understands that it is a very dangerous thing. So immediately, within the fraction of a second, okay, immediately it passes on the message to the relay neuron. This relay neuron passes on the message to the muscles of our hand. Okay, to the muscles of our hand. Now we are able to move because of the constant contraction and expansion of our muscles. Okay, whether it's a movement of our hands or whether it's a movement of our feet or body parts, this is happening because we have muscles at various parts of the body. So immediately the relay neuron will pass on the message to the muscles of our hand, and the moment it senses it, okay, it contracts. Okay, see, when I am stretching my hand like this, my muscles are expanded. When I contract, what is happening is my muscles are contracting. The moment it gets contracted, it is pulled off. It's like a horse that you are riding. When you pulled up the strings, the horse comes back, right? So in the same way, the moment the muscles of the hand are pulled back, the hand itself comes back. Okay, so it happens all within the fraction of a second. Okay, deep thinking is not involved. The involvement of the brain itself is not there. Okay, it's an automatic process that happens. The moment you touch something which is unfavorable to your body, the moment you come across something which is unfavorable to your body, you are the body part associated with it is immediately withdrawn. Okay, so here's how it happens. So the spinal cord basically conveys the message through the relay neurons to the motor neurons out here. Okay, the motor neurons are connected to the muscles and immediately the hand is withdrawn. Okay, so the immediate withdrawal of the hand basically is very much necessary. Okay, so if you understand this by a flow chart, here's what happens. Okay, the stimulus of heat. Now the stimulus of heat basically generates a pain, a certain amount of pain. So the stimulus of heat passes on to the receptor. Okay, the receptor is what? Our hands. The thermoreceptors are there. These are passed on through the sensory neurons to the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord the message is passed through the relay neurons. Okay, from the relay neurons these pass on to the motor neurons. Okay, so here it is passing by the relay neurons. The relay neurons are passing it to the motor neurons for immediate action. Okay, now motor neurons are the effector muscles here. The skin is basically the receptor, and the effector muscles are the muscles which are located in our hand. Okay, so these are the muscles of the arm are the effector out here, and the skin cells are basically the receptor out here. So it passes on to the sensory neurons to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord relays it by the means of relay neurons to the motor neurons. The motor neurons immediately contract, which means that the effector muscles are the muscles of the arm. Okay, the response, what is the response that is generated? Lifting of the hand. So against the stimulus of heat, the response that is generated is the response of lifting of hand, and this happens within the fraction of a second, very quick, no deep thinking involved, no involvement of the brain itself. Okay, a very fast automatic response, and this has to be fast. We cannot wait till eternity. Okay, so reflexes of this type which involve only the spinal cord are known as spinal reflexes. So which are involving spinal cord are known as spinal reflexes. The ones which involve the brain, so just as we saw that there are spinal reflexes which are generated from the spinal cord, in the same way we have cerebral reflexes which are generated from the brain itself. So we have learnt in the process that there are cranial nerves which are basically nerves which are present in the head part of our skull, and these cranial nerves are connecting the sensory organs like eyes, tongue, the ears and nose. Okay, so these are the sensory organs which are immediately getting connected to the brain. Okay, so the reflexes which are generated by the spinal cord are known as spinal reflexes, and the reflexes which are generated from the brain are known as cerebral reflexes. So reflex actions involving the brain are called cerebral reflexes. These are known as cerebral reflexes. For example, if we have a lot of bright light, somebody throws a torchlight on you, what will be your immediate response? You will immediately close your eyes. Okay, why does this happen? Because too much of light is not good for the cells of the eye. It has a possibility of damaging our sensation of sight. Okay, it has a possibility of damaging our eye cells, and that's really important to understand, because these days most of the mode of teaching has gone into an online mode, and there are a lot of cases which are being reported for students who are suffering from some sort of eye malfunctioning. A lot of people are putting on spectacles. In this room also there is a lot of light which is constantly disturbing me, but any which ways I am just recording it. But being in front of the computer screen or in front of the mobile screen has an impact on your eyes, because there's a lot of rays which are going inside your eye cells. Okay, so this has to be controlled. Now how do we control this? Obviously there is a natural mechanism by which it is controlled, and that is something that we are going to understand. Okay, so reflex actions involving the brain are called cerebral reflexes, and one of the very important aspects of our sensations is the sight. Okay, we all have eyes to see, except for the ones who cannot, but the sensation of sight is very important for all the reflex actions that we generate. So whenever there is too much of bright light, in our eyes there is the pupil, that this dark spot. You know why this is dark? Okay, because it doesn't reflect any amount of light. Okay, if you look closely into somebody's eyes, okay, you will find a reflection of all the neighboring things. If you look closely into somebody's eyes, you will find all the things are getting reflected except for this portion. This portion never reflects any light. Okay, this is the pupil basically, and it is the small opening through which the light enters our eyes, and obviously the image forms in the retina and so on and so forth. That's the physics part of it. But bright light, okay, if too much of bright light enters through this pupil, then it has a possibility of damaging our eye cells, and that's what has been happening. If you are too engrossed in watching your cell phones or in front of the computer screen for a long time, it might have a damaging effect on your eyes. So be careful about it. Okay, but then this is the only form of education that is left for the time being during this pandemic. So yes, our reliability is there. So what we can do is the enormous amount of time that we used to spend in watching PUBG or whatever games and all that online platforms of Instagram and all, I think this is a high time to reduce all those things. Okay, because you have to use internet and technology in order to get connected to your studies. So my suggestion is, please do refrain from more of use of things which are not required. Use technology for things which are required. Studies cannot be neglected, and use your mobile or your laptops or your computer systems to gain knowledge, but refrain from all those things which you used to do earlier. So the more you use it, the more you're risking your eyes, because there's an amount of light which definitely will enter from these devices through your pupil, and this pupil can get damaged, this eye cell can get damaged. Okay, so bright light, so pupil is basically the entry point of our eye. Okay, by a speedy reflex action, there is a speedy reflex action which is generated. The moment bright light enters, the pupil contracts. Okay, the pupil contracts to limit the amount of light entering our eyes. Okay, so this reduces the amount of light entering our eyes, because it's very important. If too much of light enters all of a sudden into your eyes, then it might have a damaging effect. For example, you must have heard that we should not look at a solar eclipse by naked eyes. Okay, we should use some form of lenses in order to see that. Okay, there are special lenses that are there to watch and observe solar eclipses. We should never directly look into a solar eclipse. Why is this notion? Because see, the solar eclipse is basically an eclipse of the sun, which is caused by moon coming in between the earth and the sun. Now this is all these celestial bodies, the moon and the earth, are moving with a high speed. So obviously in no fraction of time the sun will emerge out again. Okay, the sun gets eclipsed for a fraction of time due to a solar eclipse that happens, and it emerges out with all its light the moment the moon crosses the orbit. Okay, so all of these celestial bodies, whether it is the earth or whether it is the moon, are moving with high speeds. It will take no time for them to emerge out of that eclipse, and the moment it does, all of a sudden bright light enters your eyes, and it can cause a damaging effect to your eye cells. See, normal sun, we cannot look at it. Okay, we shouldn't be looking at it. Okay, we should never be looking at the normal sun, because it's a high amount of radiation that comes from there and might have a damaging effect. But when it's a case of an eclipse, when the sun is eclipsed by a moon, we might make an attempt to look at it, but then we should not be doing this with naked eyes, because in no time the moon will leave the orbit and the sun will emerge out again with all its glow. Okay, and that might have a very damaging effect on our eyes. So that's the reason it is always advised to look at it through the lens if you really want to see the eclipse effect. Okay, so it gets smaller. Okay, this gets smaller to limit the entry of light. The pupil gets smaller to limit the entry of light, because if a huge amount of light enters all of a sudden, it will have a damaging effect on our eye cells and we might lose our sense of vision. Okay, so that's the reason the pupil contracts. Okay, so we will first understand how the pupil works. Pupil, in excess of light it contracts, and in very dim light it expands. Because it expands, why? Because it will now observe any amount of light that is present there in the neighborhood to see things nearby. For example, if you are enclosed in a room in which all the lights are put off and you are trying to find something, then the eye pupil will enlarge. Why? Because it will use the faint amount of light which is nearby to locate that thing. Okay, so pupil of our eye enlarges so that more light can enter our eye in dim light. Okay, when it is dim light, the pupil of our eye will enlarge, and when it is huge amount of light, the pupil will contract. Okay, so the pupil contracts in presence of excess of light, and the pupil enlarges in presence of dim light. Okay, so the contraction of the pupil of the eye automatically is the presence of light, and this is due to cerebral reflexes. Okay, this is due to cerebral reflexes. So what happens basically? The stimulus of light, as we have seen that there are numerous receptors in our body located at different points. So in the previous example, just as we saw that we are removing our hand from something which is very hot. If we have accidentally touched a hot object, we will immediately put the hand will be immediately pulled off. So you are not thinking, okay, let me put my hand off, otherwise I might get burned. If you think so much, your hand will already get burnt. Okay, so there is no time for these actions for the brain to think. It has to be an automatic response. In the same way, all of a sudden, when there is enough of light which is coming inside, your pupil will contract. Okay, your pupil will contract. So the stimulus of light, what is the receptor here? The pupil of the eye. And what basically the receptor has, there are light receptors in the eye. As I said in the previous example, the skin has thermoreceptors, okay, which will acknowledge the temperature, which will indicate the high temperature. Here we have the light receptors, which will understand the amount of light, and they will produce an impulse to the sensory nerves. So the receptors produce an impulse. This travels through the sensory nerves to the brain. Okay, now what does the brain do? The brain sends its response through motor nerves to the effector muscles. The effector muscles are basically the iris. See, there is something called as iris, and this is like this. Okay, the iris muscles can actually contract and expand. They can contract and expand. In case of dim light, they contract. Okay, they let more light enter, and in case of too much of light, they expand. This is like a shutter, a camera shutter. Okay, a camera shutter it shuts down, or it has a very little opening of the pupil to enter when too much of light is there in our environment, and when there is dim light, then it will expand. Okay, so the iris is the controller of the amount of light that enters. So in this case, the effector muscles are the iris of the eye. Here the light receptors in the pupil are the ones which are sending the message to the through the cranial nerves or the sensory nerves to the brain, and the brain is automatically limiting the amount of light entering our eyes. Okay, so the pupil shrinks or the iris muscles expand. So the pupil shrinks, the pupil, the dark colored thing that we see in our eyes, that will shrink in size if too much of light enters, and the opposite will happen in case of a dim light. Okay, so this is a kind of, this is the contraction of the pupil of the eye automatically is in the presence of light. It is an example of cerebral reflex. Okay, in the previous case we understood how the reflex arc is for spinal reflexes. In this one we are trying to understand how the reflex arc is in case of cerebral reflexes. Okay, cerebral reflexes are the ones which control which are controlled through the cranial nerves, and which control the responses that we have for anything that happens in the head part. Okay, so we see through our eyes, again it has a connection to the brain directly. We hear through our ears, again it has a connection directly to the brain. We taste, then we have smell, then we have feeling of touch, and all these things are there. Okay, so there is an automatic response which is generated. Okay, I hope this makes it clear. You can take a snapshot of the same. The brain are known as cerebral reflexes, which we are going to cover in the next slide. In the meantime, you can take a snapshot. This is basically representing a reflex arc. Okay, a reflex arc, the actual pathway of the messages that are getting conveyed from the receptor to the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord to the effector muscles. Okay, so this is a continuous process which happens day to day in our lives.